From the porch of my small wooden cabin, the world seemed divided into two cruel truths, mine and his. Mine was made of floorboards that creaked under the weight of my 72 years, of the smell of damp earth that rose from the small wildflower garden I insisted on keeping alive, and of the deep silence that settled as soon as the sun set behind the Texas hills. The only sound that kept me company was the wind, a constant lament that passed through the cracks in the walls, bringing with it a cold that was not just from the night, but from the soul. His truth, on the other hand, shone in the distance, a wound of light on the dark velvet of the horizon. My son Daniel's mansion was a promise of glass and steel, a monument to the success he had built upon the ashes of what we once were. The lights on in its huge windows looked like distant and unattainable stars, each one a reminder of the abyss that now separated us. I would shrink into my old wool shawl, the same one my late husband, Roberto, gave me on our last anniversary together, and feel the night's dampness penetrate my bones. It was a different kind of cold, one that started from within, a slow fever I had been ignoring for days, but which now clung to my lungs with a sinister stubbornness. I held between my trembling fingers the only photograph I had left of our old life, the faded image of a smiling Roberto and a still young Daniel, his eyes full of a love I no longer recognized. That night, with the fever burning, my body and loneliness freezing my soul, I understood the true inheritance my husband had left. Not the money that built that cold mansion, but the emptiness it now represented. And it was in that emptiness that death began to visit me, whispering that the only thing I had left was the memory of a love that my own son had decided to bury along with his father. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. Just a deep weariness, a silent surrender to the darkness that promised, finally, to free me from the pain of looking at that illuminated house and knowing that, to my only son, I no longer existed. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of stories of healing and wisdom. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation. I ask you to join our community of souls who have gone through something similar. The fever arrived not like a wave, but like a silent thief who settles inside the house. First, it stole the warmth from my hands, then the strength from my legs, and finally the clarity from my thoughts. I woke up that Tuesday morning wrapped in sweat-damp sheets, with a weight on my chest that turned every breath into an arduous battle. The air in the small cabin was dense and stale, with the sweet smell of my illness and of the old wood that could no longer retain heat. Outside, the Texas sun shone with a cruel indifference, painting stripes of light on the dusty floor that only highlighted my neglect. I tried to get up to get a glass of water, but my muscles refused to obey. My head was spinning, and the world seemed to tilt dangerously. My son's mansion, visible from the bedroom window, seemed more distant than ever, a palace of ice on a strange planet. Every detail of my loneliness became sharp and painful. The ticking of the clock on the wall, a wedding gift from 50 years ago, sounded like a countdown. The kitchen faucet dripped with a maddening persistence, each drop a reminder of my inability to fix it. I was a prisoner in my own body, in my own home. The humiliation of having to ask for help was a poison that mixed with the disease. Daniel and his wife Amanda had been clear. "Mom, you have your independence now," they had said, the day they moved me here, their voices sounding more like a dismissal than a gesture of affection. The cabin was, according to them, more than enough for my simple needs. And now, my needs were anything but simple. I needed a doctor, medicine, a warm broth. I needed a son. But the son I had now was a stranger who lived behind glass walls, and I didn't know how to reach him. With an effort that seemed to tear the last drop of energy from my being, I managed to get to my feet. I leaned on the furniture as if they were loyal friends, each step a small victory against the dizziness that threatened to knock me down. The path to the small-town pharmacy was a dirt road that stretched for almost a mile, a distance I used to cover with ease, but which now seemed like a desert crossing. The sun punished my pale, feverish face, and the dust kicked up by passing cars stuck to my sweaty skin, creating a mask of dirt and despair. Every approaching headlight made me shrink in shame, praying it wasn't anyone I knew. But luck, as always, was not on my side. Upon entering the pharmacy, the cold air from the air conditioning was a brutal shock to my overheated body. And there, at the counter, was Mrs. Gable, whose eyes were sharper than her tongue. I pretended not to see her and went to the young pharmacist, my voice a hoarse whisper. I asked for the strongest antibiotics he could sell me without a prescription. He looked at me with professional suspicion, but got the box. The moment of truth came with the card machine. When I inserted it, the device emitted a sharp beep and denied the transaction. "Insufficient funds," the young man said, in a voice too loud, as if announcing my poverty to the whole world. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mrs. Gable's eyes, reflected in a mirror behind the counter, bored into me. She said nothing, but her silence was a verdict, a mixture of pity and satisfaction at confirming the rumors she had surely helped spread herself. The widow abandoned by her millionaire son. I had to leave there with only a cheap cough syrup, the cold glass bottle in my hand, tangible proof of my humiliation. The walk back was a blur of shame and exhaustion. The sun seemed to mock me, and every stone on the dirt road felt like an accusation. Upon reaching the cabin, the door opened with a tired groan, and I collapsed into the first chair I found, the small bottle of syrup rolling away on the wooden floor. The silence of the house was now oppressive, filled only by the sharp, painful sound of my own breathing. Outside, the world went on. I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower coming from the direction of my son's mansion, a sound of normality, of a life that went on without me, prosperous and indifferent to my struggle. I felt the hot tears finally run down my face, not of sadness, but of pure anger and helplessness. I, Elena, who raised my son alone after his father's premature death in a work accident, who washed floors and cooked for strangers so he could go to college, was now reduced to this, a pathetic, sick, and penniless figure, being judged by the gazes of the community that once respected me as a matriarch. It was then that I saw a familiar car slowing down on the road. It was Dr. Miller, the town doctor, an old friend of my Roberto. He stopped the car, his face wrinkled with age and concern, and watched me through the window for a long moment. He knocked on my door, and the sound on the old wood echoed like a sentence. I didn't know it, but that knock was not the end of my loneliness. It was the beginning of a storm that would drag all of us down. Before the glass mansion and the wooden cabin, there was our house. A small house, with a porch that my Roberto built with his own hands, and where, on hot summer nights, we would watch the fireflies dance over the lawn. We didn't have much, but what we had was real. Roberto was a man of calloused hands and an easy smile, a construction worker who believed in two things above all else: the solidity of a well-built wall and the promise of a better future for our Daniel. Every dollar he earned was divided between the needs of the present and the dreams of the future. The biggest of these dreams was our son's education. "He's not going to break his back under the sun like me, Elena," he would tell me, while wiping grease from his hands. "He's going to use his head. He's going to be someone." And so, he paid, month after month, without ever failing, a life insurance policy. For him, it wasn't an investment. It was a testament of love, a guarantee that, even if he were gone, the dreams we built for Daniel would remain standing. I remember the smell of freshly cut grass on Saturdays, the sound of his laughter echoing through the house as he played with a still young Daniel, the taste of the stew I would prepare, and that to him was the best in the world. Our wealth was not in a bank account, but in the texture of that simple, shared life. Little did we know that the same money Roberto saved to protect our son's future would be the weapon he would use to destroy our past and erase my existence. The change began subtly, like an almost invisible crack in a solid wall. The name of that crack was Amanda. Daniel met her at university, a place that to us was almost mythical, a world of books and ideas that seemed light years away from our reality in Texas. When he brought her home for the first time, She was all polished smiles and measured compliments. She called our house cozy and my food authentic, but her cold blue eyes scanned every corner with a clinical assessment, as if analyzing a museum piece. Amanda came from a family where a person's worth was measured by their zip code and the brand of car they drove. Slowly, she began to sow in Daniel the shame of his origins. Her visits became lessons in how he should distance himself from us. They were little barbs disguised as advice. "Darling, maybe your mother shouldn't wear that dress. It's so floral. Couldn't we replace this sofa? It looks a bit dated." She spoke of ambition, of networking, of building an image of success. And Daniel, eager to belong to that new world she represented, absorbed every word. I saw my son being replaced by a colder, more distant version, a man who began to look at his own home not with love, but with impatience, as if it were an old suit that no longer fit him. I tried to get close to her, to share my recipes, to tell her stories about Daniel's childhood, but she listened with an empty courtesy, her smile never reaching her eyes. She didn't want to be part of our family. She wanted Daniel to forget he ever had one. The first time humiliation hit me in public was like an unexpected blow to the stomach, leaving me breathless. It was a few months after Roberto's death, at a community barbecue we organized to thank our neighbors and friends for their support. I was still lost in a fog of grief, feeling my husband's absence in every familiar face, in every corner of the garden. Daniel and Amanda were there, circulating among the guests with an ease I did not possess. At one point, I stepped away to the kitchen to get more lemonade, and upon returning, I heard Amanda's voice, clear and distinct, coming from a group of people I didn't know, elegant friends they had brought from the city. "Daniel's mother is a sweet woman, of course, but very simple," she was saying, with a tone of false compassion that was crueler than any direct insult. "She's a little lost with all these changes, poor thing. She's a typical country woman, doesn't quite understand this new world. My world, the world I had built with my husband, for 50 years, was now reduced to an anecdote, an example of quaint simplicity to entertain my son's new rich friends. The worst part was seeing Daniel, who was close enough to hear every word. He looked in my direction. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was no defense, no correction. Just a weak, embarrassed smile he gave to the group. A silent agreement. A betrayal that echoed louder than Amanda's laughter. In that moment, in front of the people who had watched me raise my son, I was redefined. I was no longer Elena, Roberto's wife, the family matriarch. I was an encumbrance, a social burden he had to carry. The next humiliation didn't happen in front of the neighbors, but in the solitude of our kitchen table, which made it even more devastating. A few weeks after the barbecue, Daniel sat across from me with a stack of papers and a pen. Amanda waited in the car, an invisible but powerful presence. He began to speak in a rehearsed voice, full of financial terms he knew I wouldn't understand. He talked about optimizing assets, mitigating taxes, and long-term planning. Amidst the jargon, the message was clear. He wanted full control of Roberto's inheritance. To justify it, he used the cruelest words a son can say to a mother. "Mom, you've worked your whole life. You deserve to rest," he began, with a false tenderness. "But let's be honest, you wouldn't know what to do with so much money. It's a complicated world. It's better to let me and Amanda handle everything. We have the contacts, the experience." He made me feel small, ignorant, like a child who needed to be protected from herself. He continued, explaining the expenses of his new lifestyle, the need to keep up appearances for his business, and how my modest pension would be enough for my little needs. Not once did he ask what I wanted. He was dictating the terms of my new life, a life of dependence and irrelevance. Think of yourself as an extra mouth that no longer has to worry about anything, he said. And the expression extra mouth hung in the air between us, a label that defined me as a burden. I signed the papers, my hand trembling, not because I didn't understand what I was doing, but because I understood all too well. I was handing over my future to the son who had already stolen my past. The final blow, the humiliation that broke me completely, was moving day. They arrived on a Saturday morning, without warning, with a truck and two men who wouldn't look me in the eye. Daniel and Amanda orchestrated everything with cold, impersonal efficiency. The house, my house, which held the echo of all our memories, had already been sold. My neighbors, the same people who saw me arrive there as a young bride, watched from their windows and porches, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. Amanda walked through the house with a clipboard, pointing and giving orders. "This goes to donation," she said, about the dishes I had used to serve countless family dinners. "This is trash," she declared, about Roberto's old gardening tools. The humiliation was a public spectacle. At one point, she stopped in front of my rocking chair, the one where Roberto sat every night. She turned to Daniel with a loud, theatrical voice so that everyone, including the moving men and the curious neighbors, could hear. "Daniel, darling, do you really think this old thing will fit in the guest room? It doesn't match our aesthetic at all." I saw my son's face twitch. He avoided my gaze, fixing his eyes on some point on the wall. His reply was a defeated mumble. "Take it to the cabin, Amanda." And with that sentence, he drew the final line. I and everything I represented, the memories, the love, our family's history, did not belong in his new life. We were the aesthetic trash, to be hidden away in a cabin at the end of a dirt road. I was isolated and discarded in front of my entire world. Back in the present, Dr. Miller's wrinkled face floated in and out of my feverish field of vision. He had finished examining me, his professional yet gentle touch a brutal contrast to the neglect I had suffered. His silence was heavy, more frightening than any diagnosis he could verbalize. He adjusted my blankets, and I saw in his eyes a deep sadness, the sadness of a friend who had watched his best friend's family fall apart. He knew about my situation. The whole town knew. But seeing the physical consequence of that abandonment was different. He said words of comfort, that I needed to rest, that he would get help, but his expression told a much more urgent story. He took out his old cell phone, his thick fingers dialing a number I knew by heart, the number of that mansion on the hill. I tilted my head, exhaustion pulling me toward darkness, but his voice cut through the fog in my mind. "Daniel, it's Dr. Miller. Listen carefully. Your mother has double pneumonia. She is gravely ill." There was a pause, and then his voice became even firmer, each word a stone thrown against the wall of my son's indifference. "This is a matter of life and death." At that moment, I didn't know it, but in my lungs, in every difficult breath, ran a truth that no lawyer or contract could hide. And that truth was about to be delivered in a phone call that would change everything. Dr. Miller's voice, coming through the phone line, was the stone that shattered the window of my son's perfectly constructed life. Daniel told me later that, at that moment, he was in his living room, a space as large and empty as an art gallery, arguing with Amanda about the color of the new Porsche she wanted to buy. The air conditioning kept the environment at a controlled temperature, immune to the suffocating Texas heat, just as his conscience remained immune to my existence. But the doctor's words, life and death, were like a gust of desert wind that broke down the door. He said the crystal glass he was holding slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. But he didn't even hear the sound. His artificial reality dissolved, and all he could see was my face, the image of the mother he had exiled so he could enjoy his wealth in peace. Amanda's reaction was immediate and predictable. "Daniel, for God's sake, don't be so dramatic," she said with a sigh of impatience. "It's your mother. She's always complaining about something. It's just a flu. Send her some money for the doctor. That will solve the problem." It was the coldness of those words, the way she reduced me to a problem to be solved with money, that finally broke the spell she held over him. He looked at her perfectly made-up face and her eyes where there was not a drop of compassion. And then he looked around at the sterile opulence of the house. For the first time, he saw his life for what it was, a golden cage. Ignoring her screams and threats, he grabbed his car keys and ran, the sound of the luxury engine echoing like a cry of panic as he sped down the dirt road that would lead him back to the truth he had desperately tried to bury. When the cabin door swung open, the bright daylight silhouetted Daniel, and the contrast between his world and mine had never been so stark. He came in, bringing with him the subtle scent of an expensive cologne that mixed with the heavy odor of my sickness, and the sight of his impeccable suit seemed an aberration in this environment of poverty and neglect. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the dimness, and when they finally focused on me, in the unmade bed, I saw a look of horror take over his face. He had expected to find a resentful mother, perhaps angry, ready to accuse him. But what he found was a fragile woman, consumed by fever, reduced to little more than skin and bones, her gray hair stuck to her sweaty forehead. My mind, clouded by delirium, didn't register the 45-year-old man he had become, with his worry lines and carefully styled hair. In that moment of feverish confusion, my heart saw the only man who had ever loved me unconditionally, my husband, Roberto. My voice came out as a thread, a whisper barely audible over the sound of my own gasping breath. "My love, you came back," I murmured, trying to extend a trembling hand toward him. "I knew you wouldn't leave me alone." The impact of those words, of that pure, delirious love that absolved him of all guilt, hit him with the force of a punch. There was no accusation, no anger, just the unwavering certainty of my love. Daniel collapsed. His knees hit the dusty wooden floor hard, and his body was racked by a sob that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. For the first time in many years, my son cried. In an instant, guilt turned into action. With a gentleness I no longer remembered he possessed, Daniel wrapped me in the cleanest blankets he could find and lifted me into his arms. I weighed almost nothing. He carried me out of the cabin, into the blinding sunlight, and carefully placed me in the passenger seat of his luxury car, where the cold leather was a shock against my feverish skin. The drive to the mansion was a tense silence, broken only by my difficult breathing. Waiting for us at the imposing entrance, like a general ready for battle, was Amanda. Her face, upon seeing me in Daniel's arms, transformed into a mask of icy fury. "What are you doing, Daniel?" she hissed, her voice like the crack of a whip. "What is that?" The way she used the word, "that," as if I were a dirty object he had dragged into her. Immaculate home was the last straw. A dangerous calm took hold of Daniel. The man who had always feared his wife's disdain disappeared, and in his place emerged something stronger, something that resembled his father. "She's my mother, Amanda," he said, his voice low but laden with an authority that made her take a step back. "And she's staying here. Her life is in danger because of me." Amanda tried to argue, talking about reputation, appearances, what the neighbors and her friends would think. But Daniel was no longer listening to her. "If you can't live with my mother under the same roof," he continued, looking her directly in the eyes, "then the door is right there. You can leave." Without waiting for an answer, he walked past her, carrying me into the heart of the house that had been denied to me, and gently laid me down on the white velvet sofa in the vast living room, marking with that gesture the end of one alliance and the beginning of his painful redemption. The days that followed were a blur of medicine, needles, and the unfamiliar faces of nurses Daniel had hired. The mansion, once a sanctuary of silent opulence, was transformed into an intensive care unit. Amanda disappeared into her room, and the house was plunged into a cold war, where meals were left on trays at the door, and the only words exchanged were through angry text messages. Daniel never left my side. He would sit in an expensive chair, which looked uncomfortable, and watch me for hours on end. His face a map of guilt and exhaustion. He changed my compresses, helped the nurses, read quietly to me, even when I was sleeping. In every gesture, I saw his desperate attempt to redeem himself, to care for my body to avoid having to deal with the wound he had opened in my soul. Gradually, as the antibiotics took effect, the fever began to subside, and the fog in my mind began to clear. I had moments of lucidity where I saw the anguish in his eyes, the fear of what would happen when I was strong enough to confront him. He cared for me with a frantic dedication, as if he could reverse time with medication and cashmere blankets. But we both knew that the sickness in my body was the easiest to cure. The real wound was between us, silent and infected. And the conversation that was approaching would be more painful than any fever. The next morning, what I did would leave everyone, especially him, speechless. We would like to feel your presence at this very moment. Please, write in the comments which city you are watching us from and what time it is there now. By doing this, we create a network of energy and support for this story, a reminder that we are not alone in our battles. Every comment is a point of light in our healing process. The next morning, the fever had receded, leaving behind a fragile but sharp clarity. Daniel tiptoed into the room, his face pale and anxious, prepared for the storm of accusations he believed he deserved. He expected yelling, tears, recriminations, but I gave him none of that. My strength was never in the volume of my voice, but in the depth of my silence. With a gesture, I asked him to help me get up. He obeyed, his strong arms supporting me with a guilty hesitation. I ignored the velvet sofa where he had laid me and pointed to a simple wooden chair one of the nurses had brought, positioning it in front of the enormous glass window that overlooked the meticulously manicured garden. I sat there, with my back to the opulence of the room, and watched the flight of a hummingbird. He stood, not knowing what to do, his massive presence seeming out of place in the silence I had imposed. After a long moment, I turned to him, and my voice, though weak, was firm. Daniel, I would like a cup of tea, with 2 spoons of sugar and a drop of milk, the way I used to make it for you after school. The request, so simple, so domestic, hit him harder than any shout. It wasn't a request from a patient, but a gentle order from a mother. In that instant, in that room that was foreign to me, I was no longer his victim. I was reminding him of who I was, of who we were, and silently taking back control of our life's narrative. The tension built throughout the day, a static electricity that filled every corner of that cold house. In the evening, the last nurse left, leaving us alone for the first time since I had arrived. The gas fireplace was lit, its perfectly symmetrical flames dancing without warmth, a perfect reflection of that home. I remained in my chair, watching the artificial fire, when I felt his spirit finally break. He approached slowly and knelt at my feet, the sound of his knees hitting the expensive rug being the only noise in the room. His facade of control completely crumbled, and he buried his face in my lap, his body shaken by deep, painful sobs that came from a place of long repressed shame. "Mom, forgive me," he stammered, the words muffled by the fabric of my robe. "I threw you away as if you were nothing. I traded you for all of this." His confession came out in a rush, a torrent of words detailing his weakness, his greed, the way Amanda's voice had become louder in his head than his own conscience. He didn't try to justify himself or blame anyone. He just exposed his ugliness, his monstrosity, with a brutal honesty that was, in itself, a plea for salvation. "I would look at the glamour of this house and feel powerful," he confessed, his voice choked. "But inside, I was rotting. I let you die, Mom, for money." I didn't interrupt him. I just let him speak, empty out all the poison, because I knew that healing could only begin when the wound was completely open. When the flow of his words finally dried up, and only the sound of his crying remained, I raised one of my hands, which still trembled slightly, and touched his hair. He flinched at my touch, as if he didn't feel worthy of it. Gently, I made him lift his face, forcing him to look at me. His eyes were red and swollen, the eyes of the scared little boy I had once comforted from nightmares. "Money buys a house, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and clear in the silence of the night. "But it doesn't build a home. A home is made of memories, of respect, of knowing you have a safe place to return to." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. I lost my husband, and for a while, I thought I had lost my son too. That was the true inheritance of poverty, the loneliness that all the money in the world couldn't fill. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but I placed a finger on his lips. My forgiveness would not be an easy absolution that would erase the past. It would be an invitation to build a different future. What you did almost destroyed me, I admitted, with a necessary honesty. But hatred is too heavy a burden for an old woman's shoulders. The only thing that matters now is that you found your way back home. And with that acceptance, I was not only freeing him from his guilt, I was freeing myself from my pain. My acceptance was not a balm that soothed him. It was a fire that galvanized him. Daniel realized that redemption required more than tears. It required action. The next morning, he confronted Amanda. I don't know the details of the conversation, but I know it was short. She gave him an ultimatum. It was her or me. And for the first time in his life, he chose me. Amanda packed her bags, her face a mask of contempt and disbelief. I watched her leave from the window, getting into her sports car without a backward glance, disappearing down the road like a ghost from a life that no longer existed. Her departure left a void in the house, but it was a clean void, full of possibilities. In the days that followed, Daniel moved with a fierce determination. He put a for sale sign in front of the mansion he and Amanda had coveted so much. To him, every luxury object, every glass wall, was a reminder of his moral failure. He sold the cars, the watches, the designer clothes, systematically stripping himself of the symbols of the identity that had almost destroyed him. It was a process of purification, a way of shedding his old skin so a new one could grow. He was demolishing the monument to his greed, brick by brick, so that he could build something of lasting value on its ruins. We didn't go back to the cabin. Daniel sold the mansion for a fortune, but instead of reinvesting in more luxury, he bought a modest house in the heart of our old town. A house with a porch, like the one I had with Roberto, and a yard big enough for my garden. With the millions that were left, he did something that brought me to tears. In honor of the father he had finally come to respect again, he created the Roberto and Elena Senior Support Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring that no other elderly person in our community would suffer the kind of abandonment and neglect that I did. Our life found a new rhythm, a new purpose. My mornings are now spent among my roses and tomatoes, and the afternoons helping Daniel review aid requests for the foundation. He no longer wears expensive suits, but jeans and simple shirts. The haunted look has been replaced by a hard-won serenity. He found his redemption not by asking for forgiveness, but by making it his life's mission. We traded a view of the distant city lights for a view of a bed of sunflowers we planted together in the backyard. Today, I have no luxury, but I have respect. And that, no one can take from me again. Have you ever done a kind gesture that changed someone's life? Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. 3 years have passed. Time, which was once my enemy, a thief that stole my hope with every sunrise, has become my friend, a patient gardener who tended to my wounds and watched me blossom again. Today, at 75, sitting in a colorful chair at the community center our foundation built, I feel the warmth of the afternoon sun on my face, not as a punishment, but as a caress. Around me, the most beautiful sound in the world, the laughter of children. I read them the story of a little bird who got lost from his family, but, with the help of other forest animals, found his way back to a nest even stronger and warmer. Their small, curious eyes are fixed on me, and in them I do not see the figure of pity I once was, but a grandmother, a storyteller. Beside me, handing out cups of juice and cookies, is Daniel, the man in I. Expensive suits has completely disappeared, and in his place is a man in simple clothes, with dirt under his fingernails from working in the community garden this morning. His smile is no longer a mask to hide insecurity. It is genuine, born from a place of inner peace he never knew in his glass mansion. He found his wealth not in the stock market, but in the whispered thanks of the elderly we help, and in the sticky hugs of the children. The old cabin, the scene of my greatest despair, has been transformed. Together, we demolished it, plank by plank, and in its place, we planted a memorial garden in Roberto's name. a public place full of wildflowers and wooden benches where people from the town come to find a moment of peace. Sometimes I linger looking at my reflection in the windows of the community center. It took me a long time to recognize myself in the mirror, but today, finally, I see the woman I have become.